Picture this. It's a cold morning in 1655, and the cobblestone streets of Newcastle echo with the sound of wooden clogs and hushed whispers. But today, there's something different. A crowd is gathering, pointing and jeering at a figure stumbling down the main thoroughfare. This isn't just any drunk making his way home after a night at the tavern. No, this man is trapped inside what looks like a giant wooden barrel, his head and arms protruding through crude holes, forced to parade his shame before the entire town. This is the drunkard's cloak, one of history's most bizarre and humiliating punishments. And what happened to the man wearing it that day would change how an entire community viewed justice forever. Welcome back to the channel, History Buffs. If you're fascinated by the darker, stranger corners of human justice, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because today we're diving deep into a punishment so unusual, so psychologically devastating, that it makes modern community service look like a vacation. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this medieval method of shaming was both brilliant and barbaric in equal measure. But first, let me ask you this in the comments below. What's the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you in public? Because I guarantee it doesn't compare to what these repeat offenders had to endure. And stick around until the end, because I'm going to reveal the shocking true story of what happened when one man refused to wear the drunkard's cloak, and how his defiance led to a punishment that was far, far worse. The year is 1624, and alcohol is flowing through European towns like water through a broken dam. But unlike today, drunkenness isn't just a personal problem or a health concern. In the rigid social hierarchy of the 17th century, public intoxication is seen as a direct threat to the moral fabric of society itself. The Puritans, who dominated much of England and colonial America during this period, viewed alcohol abuse as nothing short of a sin against God, a corruption of the soul that needed to be purged, not just from the individual, but made visible to the entire community as a warning. Enter Thomas Appletree, a repeat offender whose story has been preserved in the court records of Newcastle upon Tyne. Thomas wasn't just any drunk. He was what we might today call a functioning alcoholic, a blacksmith who could work during the day, but transformed into a public menace after dark. His crimes weren't violent, but they were persistent. Public urination, disturbing the peace, blasphemy while intoxicated, and the cardinal sin of all sins, drinking on the Sabbath. The local magistrates had tried everything with Thomas. Fines meant nothing to a man who spent every penny on ale. Stocks were ineffective because he'd simply sleep off his hangover and return to his old ways. Even brief imprisonment failed because the moment he was released, he'd head straight to the nearest tavern. The authorities needed something different, something that would attack not just his body or his purse, but his very identity within the community. And so, on a grey morning, in November 1624, Thomas Appletree became one of the first documented cases of a man forced to wear the drunkard's cloak. But this wasn't just any barrel. The device was carefully crafted by the town's carpenter, a man ironically named John Sober, who took a twisted pride in his work. The barrel stood nearly 4 feet tall, with holes precisely cut to accommodate the offender's head and arms. The wood was deliberately left rough and splintered, ensuring that every movement would be uncomfortable. Around the circumference, burned into the wood with a hot iron, were the words, "I am a drunkard and a burden to my community." But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn that most people don't know about. The drunkard's cloak wasn't actually meant to be physically painful. In fact, compared to other punishments of the era like flogging, branding, or mutilation, it was remarkably humane from a bodily perspective. The true genius and the true cruelty of this punishment lay in its psychological impact. Imagine Thomas's first morning in the cloak. He couldn't dress himself properly, couldn't eat without assistance, couldn't perform even the most basic human functions with dignity. But worse than the physical inconvenience was the social death that accompanied it. In a society where reputation was everything, where a man's word and standing in the community determined his livelihood, his marriage prospects, his children's future, the drunkard's cloak was essentially a public execution of character. The punishment typically lasted anywhere from 1 to 7 days, depending on the offense and the discretion of the magistrate. During this time, the offender was required to walk through the town's main streets during the busiest hours, usually market day, when the maximum number of people would witness their shame. They couldn't hide in their homes, couldn't avoid the stares and jeers, couldn't escape the constant reminder of their failure as a member of society. Children would follow them through the streets, throwing mud, and refuse. Former friends would cross to the other side of the road to avoid association. Potential customers would refuse to do business with someone who had been publicly marked as unreliable and immoral. The punishment created a social ripple effect that extended far beyond the individual wearing the cloak. But what made the drunkard's cloak particularly insidious was how it transformed the offender into a living morality play. Every person who saw them was forced to confront their own relationship with alcohol, their own potential for moral failure. The spectacle served as both entertainment and education, a visceral reminder of what happened to those who strayed from the narrow path of righteous behavior. The psychological research of modern times has shown us just how devastating public shaming can be to the human psyche. The drunkard's cloak attacked the fundamental human need for belonging, for respect, for dignity. It weaponized the very social bonds that held communities together, turning them into instruments of punishment. And here's something that will blow your mind. It worked. Court records from various English towns show that repeat offences dropped dramatically in areas where the drunkard's cloak was regularly employed. Men who had been chronic public nuisances often became model citizens after just one experience with the barrel. But at what cost? The punishment began to spread throughout England and into the American colonies, with each region adding its own local variations. In some areas, the barrel was painted with bright, humiliating colors. In others, bells were attached to ensure the offender could never move silently through the streets. Some particularly creative magistrates required the offender to recite religious verses or public apologies at regular intervals throughout their ordeal. But perhaps the most chilling variation came from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Puritan settlers took the concept to its logical extreme. There, the drunkard's cloak was combined with other shaming devices. Offenders might be required to wear the barrel while also being fitted with a wooden gag carved to look like a bottle, or forced to carry signs detailing their specific crimes in graphic detail. The colonial records tell us about Benjamin Carter, a miller from Salem, who was sentenced to the drunkard's cloak in 1663 after his third offense of public drunkenness. But Benjamin's story reveals the dark underbelly of this seemingly civilized punishment. After wearing the barrel for 3 days, he developed severe shoulder injuries from the weight and friction. More seriously, he suffered what we would now recognize as a complete psychological breakdown. Benjamin never recovered. The shame of his public humiliation, combined with the social ostracism that followed, led him to complete isolation. He lost his business, his wife left him, and his children refused to acknowledge him as their father. Within 6 months, Benjamin Carter was found dead in his mill, having taken his own life. The community that had sought to reform him through shame had instead destroyed him completely. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of the drunkard's cloak. Its effectiveness was also its greatest cruelty. By attacking the psychological and social foundations of a person's existence, it achieved what physical punishment often could not, but in doing so, it sometimes crossed the line from correction to destruction. The device also reveals fascinating insights into the social dynamics of pre-modern communities. The fact that public shaming was considered an effective punishment tells us how tightly knit these societies were, how much individual identity depended on community acceptance. In our modern world of anonymity and mobility, such a punishment would be far less devastating. You could simply move to another town, start over, reinvent yourself. But in the 17th century, your community was your entire world. Interestingly, the drunkard's cloak was almost exclusively used on men. This wasn't because women didn't drink or cause public disturbances, but because the punishment was specifically designed to attack masculine dignity and authority. For women, different shaming devices were employed, often focusing on their roles as wives and mothers rather than their standing as independent members of the community. The decline of the drunkard's cloak began in the early 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas about human dignity and the purpose of punishment began to take hold. Reformers argued that such public humiliation was not only barbaric but counterproductive, creating social outcasts rather than reformed citizens. The rise of more private forms of punishment, including the modern prison system, gradually replaced these public spectacles. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. Remember how I promised to tell you about the man who refused to wear the drunkard's cloak? In 1678, a tavern keeper named William Morrison in the town of Hexham was sentenced to the punishment after repeatedly serving alcohol during prohibited hours. But William was different from other offenders. He was wealthy, well-connected, and absolutely refused to submit to what he called barbarous public degradation. William's resistance created a legal crisis. The magistrates had never encountered outright refusal before. Most offenders, however reluctantly, eventually submitted to avoid even worse punishments. But William hired lawyers, appealed to higher courts, and turned his case into a public debate about the nature of justice itself. The standoff lasted for months. William remained in jail rather than submit to the barrel, arguing that such punishment violated his rights as an Englishman. The case eventually reached the attention of legal scholars in London, who began to question whether public shaming punishments were compatible with emerging concepts of human rights and legal procedure. In the end, William won, but at a cost that illustrates the true power of the drunkard's cloak. Rather than forcing him into the barrel, the authorities commuted his sentence to a massive fine and permanent banishment from the county. William had avoided the public humiliation, but he had still lost his community, his business, and his place in society. The threat of the drunkard's cloak had achieved its purpose even without being implemented. This case became a legal precedent that gradually led to the abandonment of public shaming punishments throughout the English-speaking world. By the mid-18th century, the drunkard's cloak had largely disappeared, remembered only in court records and the occasional museum piece. But the psychological principles behind the drunkard's cloak never truly disappeared. Today, we see echoes of this medieval punishment in everything from online shaming campaigns to public mugshot websites. The human desire to use social ostracism as a tool for behavior modification remains as powerful as ever, even if the methods have evolved. The story of the drunkard's cloak ultimately forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, community, and human dignity. Was it a brilliant solution to a persistent social problem, or a cruel and unusual punishment that destroyed lives? The answer, like most historical truths, is probably both. What do you think? Could public shaming ever be an appropriate punishment in modern society? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more deep dives into history's strangest punishments. Next week, we're exploring the Scold's Bridle, another medieval device designed to silence and shame, with some surprising connections to modern debates about free speech. You won't want to miss it.